Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, August 1987. A resort town on a glacial lake where wealthy families from Chicago built summer estates, where church groups organized youth camps along the shoreline, and where children spent warm August days swimming, fishing, and exploring the woods that surrounded the pristine water. The Hartley family lived in Kenosha, about 45 minutes south of Lake Geneva, and Martin worked as an accountant while Patricia was a librarian, and they had 2 children, Iris, who was 12, and Rowan, who was 9, and the family attended First Baptist Church where they were active in youth programs. Rowan had dark blonde hair that he kept cut short, green eyes, and a quiet, reserved personality that made him seem more comfortable with animals and nature than with other children, and he loved fishing, could spend hours on a dock with a fishing rod waiting patiently for a bite. Iris was outgoing and confident, protective of her younger brother, and she often translated for him in social situations because Rowan was shy and spoke softly, and the siblings were close despite their personality differences, and Iris made sure no one at school bullied Rowan for being quiet. In mid-August 1987, First Baptist Church organized a week-long summer camp at Lake Geneva for children ages 8 to 14, and the camp was held at Cedar Point Christian Camp, a facility with cabins, a dining hall, and a long wooden pier extending into the lake. The camp was directed by Dennis Voss, who was 42 years old, and had been running youth camps for 15 years, and he was well known in the church community as energetic and dedicated, and parents trusted him completely with their children, and 28 kids from First Baptist attended that August session. Rowan and Iris both went to camp, and Patricia and Martin dropped them off on Sunday, August 9th, and Rowan brought his fishing rod hoping to catch bass from the pier, and he waved goodbye to his parents with a small smile, excited but nervous about being away from home. The week progressed normally with swimming lessons, nature hikes, campfire songs, and Bible study sessions, and Rowan spent most of his free time at the pier fishing, and Iris checked on him regularly, making sure he was eating and socializing at least minimally with other campers. On Thursday, August 13th, the schedule included free time in the afternoon, and around 3 o'clock Rowan took his fishing rod and walked to the pier, and Iris was at the arts and crafts cabin making a leather bracelet, and she could see the pier from the window. She watched Rowan walk to the end of the pier and cast his line, and he sat down with his legs dangling over the edge, and everything seemed normal and peaceful, and Iris returned her attention to her project, and about 15 minutes passed. When Iris looked up again toward the pier, she saw a man talking to Rowan, and the man was not a camp counselor, was not someone she recognized, and he was crouched beside Rowan pointing at something in the water, and Iris felt uneasy but did not know why. She watched as the man helped Rowan stand up, and they walked together off the pier toward the parking area, and Iris saw the man put his hand on Rowan's shoulder, and they disappeared behind the dining hall, and Iris thought maybe it was a camp volunteer or maintenance worker, but something felt wrong. She left the arts and crafts cabin and walked toward the pier calling Rowan's name, and when she reached it, she found his fishing rod lying on the wooden planks with the line still in the water, and Rowan was gone, and Iris's uneasiness turned to panic. If this happened in your neighborhood, wouldn't you want to know how it was finally solved? Tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. It's incredible to see how far these stories travel, and if you'd like to follow more mysteries finally solved through DNA, consider subscribing to the DNA Archives, where every day we uncover another truth time tried to hide. Iris ran to the camp office and told the counselor that Rowan was gone, that a man had taken him from the pier, and the counselor asked what man, and Iris described him as tall with dark hair and a blue jacket, but the counselor said there were no adult visitors at camp that day. Director Dennis Voss was called, and he organized a search of the camp property, and counselors and campers looked everywhere calling Rowan's name, checking cabins, the beach, the trails, but Rowan was not found, and Voss called the police at 3:45. Walworth County Sheriff's deputies arrived within 30 minutes, and Detective Lawrence Palmer took lead on the case, and he was 51 years old with 28 years of experience, and he interviewed Iris asking exactly what she had seen. Iris described the man, said he had been talking to Rowan, had walked with him off the pier, and they had gone toward the parking area, but Palmer seemed skeptical, asking if she was sure, if she might have been confused, if the man might have been a counselor she did not recognize. Iris insisted she knew all the counselors, that this was someone different, and she said Rowan would not leave his fishing rod unless something was wrong, and Palmer collected the fishing rod as evidence and organized a search of the area beyond the camp property. Search dogs were brought in and given Rowan's clothing from his cabin to establish his scent, and they tracked from the pier to the parking area, and then the scent trail ended abruptly, suggesting Rowan had gotten into a vehicle, and Palmer realized this was likely an abduction. Witnesses in the parking area were sought, but camp was in session and most people were with their groups, and no one reported seeing a man with a child or a vehicle leaving, and descriptions of cars that had been there earlier were too vague to be useful. Director Voss provided a list of all adults who had access to the camp, including staff, counselors, volunteers, and maintenance workers, and Palmer began interviewing each person, and all claimed to have been with their assigned groups and had not seen Rowan or a strange man. Patricia and Martin Hartley were called and drove immediately to Cedar Point, and when they arrived, Palmer told them Rowan was missing, that Iris said she saw a man take him from the pier, and Patricia started screaming, asking how this could happen at a church camp where children were supposed to be supervised. The search expanded immediately with officers checking every road leading away from Cedar Point Christian Camp, with roadblocks set up on Highway 50 and County Road H. But hours had passed since Rowan disappeared, and a vehicle could have traveled in any direction. Detective Palmer questioned why camp security had been so lax that an unknown adult could walk onto the property, approach a child, and leave without being challenged, and Director Voss said the camp had open access from the road and lake, and they relied on counselors to supervise children in designated areas. He said Rowan had been at the pier during free time, that children were allowed to fish there if they stayed visible, and counselors checked periodically, but they could not watch every child constantly, and Palmer was frustrated by the lack of oversight that had allowed an abduction. Palmer interviewed all 28 children at the camp, asking if anyone had seen the man Iris described, but most had been in other areas, and those who had been near the pier said they had not noticed anyone unusual, and only Iris claimed to have seen the abduction. He questioned whether a 12-year-old's account was reliable, whether Iris might have been mistaken about what she saw, whether she might have looked away and missed Rowan simply walking away on his own. But Iris was adamant she had seen a man take her brother. Media coverage began that evening with Rowan's school photo showing his blonde hair and shy smile appearing on Milwaukee and Chicago news stations, and the story of a child vanishing from a church camp shocked Wisconsin, where such camps were considered safe havens. Patricia appeared on television holding Rowan's fishing rod and begging for his return, describing his quietness and his love of fishing, and Martin stood beside her unable to speak, and Iris stood with them crying and saying she had seen a man take him, pleading for people to believe her. Days turned into weeks with massive searches of forests and parks around Lake Geneva, with dive teams searching the lake itself in case Rowan had fallen in, but his body was never found, and searches along roads and highways produced no evidence. Palmer investigated Dennis Voss and the camp staff thoroughly, checking backgrounds and interviewing everyone multiple times, and he found no evidence of inappropriate behavior or criminal history, and all staff members had alibis for when Rowan disappeared. Voss cooperated fully with the investigation, provided all records, allowed searches of the camp facility and his own home, and he seemed genuinely devastated by what had happened, and Palmer could not find anything connecting him to Rowan's disappearance. The investigation stalled by October 1987 with no suspects, no credible witnesses beyond Iris, whose account remained uncorroborated, and no physical evidence beyond the fishing rod left on the pier, and the Hartley family was left with devastating uncertainty. Cold cases don't stay alive unless people keep remembering them, so if you want more stories like this, cases that seemed forgotten until DNA brought answers, subscribe to the DNA archives and help these stories stay alive. New investigations and discoveries are shared here every day. Patricia and Martin could not return to Cedar Point or Lake Geneva. The place was forever associated with losing Rowan, and they stopped attending First Baptist Church because they blamed the church for organizing the camp where their son was taken. Iris struggled enormously with guilt and frustration. She had seen what happened, had witnessed the abduction, but adults had questioned her account, had suggested she was mistaken, and she carried the burden of being the only witness to her brother's disappearance. She developed severe anxiety and had nightmares about Rowan calling for help while she did nothing, and therapy helped but did not erase the guilt, and she became obsessed with missing children cases, determined to help other families in ways she could not help her own. Years passed and Rowan's case became one of Wisconsin's most haunting unsolved child disappearances, and his face appeared on age progression posters showing what he might look like at 15, at 25, at 35, but no credible sightings ever materialized. Detective Palmer retired in 2009 after 42 years in law enforcement, and Rowan's case remained unsolved. The boy who vanished from a church camp pier, and he had never been able to determine what happened despite believing Iris had seen something real. Martin died in 2016 from complications of diabetes at age 68, and he died still wondering what had happened to his son, still angry that a church camp had failed to protect him, still believing Rowan was alive somewhere. Patricia remained in Kenosha, living alone in the house on 75th Street, and she kept Rowan's bedroom unchanged with his fishing magazines, his tackle box, and photographs of him with fish he had caught, and she volunteered with organizations supporting families of missing children. Iris became a social worker specializing in child protection, and she worked for the Wisconsin Department of Children and Families investigating abuse and neglect cases, and her experience losing Rowan motivated her to protect other children from harm. In June 2024, 37 years after Rowan disappeared, the Walworth County Sheriff's Department received a phone call from a man in Thunder Bay, Ontario, Canada, who said his name was Rowan Hartley, that he had been kidnapped from a camp in Wisconsin when he was 9, and he wanted to come home. The call was transferred to Detective Sarah Mitchell, who now handled cold missing persons cases, and she listened as the man explained he was 46 years old, had been living in Canada his entire adult life under a different name, and had only recently discovered his true identity. He said he had been taken from Lake Geneva and driven across the border into Canada. His identity had been changed, and he had been placed with a family who raised him believing he was their adopted son, and he had lived decades not knowing he had been stolen. Mitchell was cautious because over the decades several people had falsely claimed to be Rowan Hartley. But something about this man's voice, his specific memories of the pier and the fishing rod, made her take him seriously, and she asked him to explain how he had discovered his identity. The man said he had been raised in Thunder Bay by Harold and Susan Fletcher, who told him his name was Eric Fletcher, that they had adopted him through a private agency when he was 9, and he had believed this story his entire childhood, though fragments of earlier memories haunted him. He remembered a pier, a fishing rod, a girl who might have been his sister, and a lake surrounded by trees. But when he asked about these memories, the Fletchers said they were dreams or confusion from trauma before the adoption, and he had accepted their explanation. Harold Fletcher had died in 2019, and Susan had died in March 2024, and while sorting through their belongings, Eric had found a locked box in the basement containing documents that revealed everything was a lie. Inside were newspaper clippings about Rowan Hartley's disappearance from Lake Geneva, a birth certificate with the name Rowan Martin Hartley, forged adoption papers, and letters between Harold Fletcher and someone named Dennis Voss, discussing payment and logistics for obtaining a child. The letters revealed that the Fletchers had paid $50,000 to Voss for a child, that Voss ran a network that acquired children through summer camps and placed them with couples willing to pay, and that Rowan had been specifically selected because he was quiet and less likely to resist or draw attention. Mitchell felt her heart racing as she realized this suggested an organized child trafficking operation that had used church camps as hunting grounds, and she asked the man to come to Wisconsin immediately, and she began investigating Dennis Voss, who she discovered had died in 2021. 3 days later, a man walked into the Walworth County Sheriff's Department, and he was 46 years old with dark blonde hair now graying, green eyes, and a quiet demeanor, and he carried a fishing rod that he said had belonged to him as a child, found in the Fletcher's garage. Mitchell met with him in a private interview room, and the man introduced himself as Rowan Hartley, though he said he had been called Eric Fletcher for 37 years, and he explained that discovering the truth had shattered his understanding of his entire life. He said the Fletchers had been loving parents in many ways, had raised him comfortably in Thunder Bay, had sent him to college, but they had stolen him from his real family, had paid for him like property, and he was struggling to process the betrayal. Mitchell collected a DNA sample from Rowan, and also contacted Patricia Hartley, who was now 78 years old and still living in Kenosha, and she told her someone claiming to be Rowan had come forward with evidence of a trafficking network, and Patricia collapsed from shock. Iris flew to Wisconsin from Madison, where she was living, and when Mitchell told her that Rowan had returned, that her testimony about seeing a man take him had been correct all along, that she had been telling the truth for 37 years, Iris broke down crying with relief and validation. The DNA results came back 2 weeks later, and Mitchell called Patricia to tell her the news. The DNA confirmed with 99.9% probability that Eric Fletcher was Rowan Hartley. Her son was alive and had been living in Canada for 37 years. Patricia screamed and cried. 37 years of not knowing replaced by the miracle and horror of learning Rowan had survived, but had been sold to strangers through a trafficking network operated by the camp director her family had trusted. The reunion was arranged carefully with counselors present, and when Patricia saw Rowan for the first time in 37 years, she saw her 9-year-old son in the face of a 46-year-old man, and they embraced awkwardly, strangers connected by biology and tragedy. Rowan struggled to call her mom, because Susan Fletcher had been his mother for 37 years, and he had complex feelings about the Fletchers, anger at the lie but also love for people who had raised him, and he was trying to process decades of deception. 20 years later, one overlooked fragment changed everything, and that's what we explore here. The moment science meets persistence. So if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss the next story where DNA finally tells the truth. A new case drops every day on the DNA archives. Iris met Rowan and reminded him she was his sister, that she had seen him taken from the pier, that she had tried to tell people but had not been believed. And Rowan had vague memories of a girl, fragments that might have been Iris, and they cried together for the childhood stolen from both of them. Mitchell began investigating the trafficking network that Dennis Voss had operated, and she discovered that Voss had died in 2021, but had run Cedar Point Christian Camp from 1982 until 2003, and during those years at least 12 children had disappeared from camps he directed. She contacted law enforcement agencies across the Midwest, requesting files on missing children from church camps between 1980 and 2005, and she found patterns: children vanishing during free time, minimal security, and investigations that stalled without leads. The letters between Voss and Harold Fletcher revealed that Voss had connections across the U.S.-Canada border, that he worked with adoptive placement brokers who matched stolen children with desperate couples, and that he had operated for decades hidden behind his reputation as a devoted youth minister. Mitchell worked with FBI agents specializing in human trafficking, and they began identifying other victims of Voss's network, tracking down adults who had been adopted through suspicious circumstances during the 1980s and 90s, and several came forward with stories similar to Rowan's. They discovered that Voss had specifically targeted church camps because parents trusted religious organizations completely, security was minimal, and children were taught to obey authority figures without question, making them vulnerable to manipulation and abduction. Voss had identified children who were quiet or shy like Rowan, who would not immediately scream or resist, and he had coordinated with accomplices who would approach children during unsupervised moments, claim an emergency or authority, and walk them to waiting vehicles. The children were driven across state lines or into Canada where their identities were changed, and they were placed with couples who paid between $40,000 and $70,000 per child, couples who were infertile and desperate and willing to believe the children were legal private adoptions. Mitchell discovered that Voss had earned over $2 million through the trafficking network during his 21 years operating Cedar Point and other camps, and he had hidden the money in offshore accounts that were discovered during the investigation of his estate. Because Voss was dead, he could not be prosecuted, but Mitchell charged 3 individuals who had worked with him and were still alive, including a placement broker who had matched stolen children with adoptive families, and all 3 were arrested and faced federal trafficking charges. The case attracted massive national attention, and investigations expanded to other summer camps and youth programs across the country, and authorities discovered that similar networks had operated in multiple states, using recreational programs as cover for child acquisition. Rowan struggled to adjust to his reclaimed identity after 37 years as Eric Fletcher, and he had a wife and 2 teenage children in Thunder Bay who were shocked to learn their husband and father had been a kidnapped child, and navigating these relationships was painful and complex. His wife Jennifer had known him as Eric for 18 years, and learning he was actually Rowan, that his entire identity had been stolen, created a crisis in their marriage, and they entered counseling to process the revelation and decide if they could continue together. His children aged 16 and 14 struggled to understand that their grandparents, Harold and Susan, had bought their father illegally, that their family was built on a crime, and that they had biological extended family in Wisconsin they had never known existed. Patricia tried to build a relationship with Rowan, but the gap was enormous, and she had also lost her husband Martin, who died without knowing Rowan was alive, and the injustice of that loss made her grief more painful, and she struggled to connect with this stranger who was her son. Iris connected with Rowan more easily, perhaps because she carried less weight of maternal expectation, and she told him about the day he disappeared, about watching from the arts and crafts cabin, about seeing the man take him, about not being believed for 37 years. Rowan had no memory of that day, no memory of the man who took him, no memory of the drive to Canada, and his first clear memories began in Thunder Bay with the Fletchers, and everything before was fragments and shadows that might have been memories, or might have been dreams. The trial of Voss's accomplices began in November 2024, and Rowan testified about being raised as Eric Fletcher, about discovering the documents, about learning he had been stolen and sold, and the jury was visibly moved by his testimony and by testimony from other victims. All three defendants were convicted and received sentences ranging from 30 years to life in prison for conspiracy to traffic children, and while justice was served, it could not return the decades stolen from victims or repair the families destroyed by the network. The case sparked federal investigations into oversight of youth programs, and new laws were passed requiring background checks for all camp staff, mandatory reporting protocols for missing children, security measures at camp facilities, and regular inspections of programs serving minors. Rowan returned to Thunder Bay after the trial to try to salvage his marriage and maintain relationships with his children, but the revelation had fractured his family, and Jennifer struggled to accept that the man she married had a completely different history than what she had believed. His children were angry and confused, angry at their deceased grandparents for what they had done, confused about their identity and family history, and Rowan tried to help them process emotions he was still processing himself, and family therapy became a regular part of their lives. He also tried to maintain connection with Patricia and Iris in Wisconsin, flying down quarterly to visit, trying to build relationships with family he barely knew, and the effort was exhausting emotionally, trying to be son and brother to strangers while being husband and father to a family in crisis. Patricia established a foundation in 2025 called the Rowan Hartley Child Safety Initiative, dedicated to improving security at youth camps and recreational programs, funding background checks and security systems, and supporting victims of child trafficking and their families. The foundation also advocated for better training for law enforcement in recognizing trafficking networks, for taking child witness testimony seriously as Iris's account should have been taken seriously in 1987, and for creating databases to track suspicious disappearances from youth programs. The months following the trial were filled with painful revelations as more victims of Voss's network came forward, and investigators identified 11 other children who had been taken from camps and placed with families across North America, and some had been reunited with biological families while others chose to remain with the families who raised them. Rowan became a spokesperson for trafficking survivors despite his discomfort with attention, and he spoke at conferences about the long-term impact of identity theft, about living decades as someone else, about the psychological damage of discovering your entire childhood was based on a crime. He emphasized that the Fletchers had been kind parents in many ways, had provided for him and loved him, but that kindness did not erase the crime of buying a stolen child, and he struggled daily with reconciling love and betrayal, with grieving people who had harmed him deeply while also raising him. Jennifer ultimately decided she could not continue the marriage. The foundation of their relationship had been based on false identity, and learning Eric was actually Rowan, who had been trafficked, created a psychological barrier she could not overcome, and they divorced in 2026. Rowan shared custody of his children and maintained relationships with them, though strained, and they struggled with their identity as children of a trafficking victim, as grandchildren of people who had participated in child trafficking, and therapy helped them process these complex emotions. He moved to Milwaukee to be closer to Patricia and Iris while maintaining access to his children in Thunder Bay, and he found work as a carpenter, a quiet profession that allowed him to process his emotions while working with his hands, creating something tangible and real. Patricia's health declined in 2027 with heart problems and cancer. And knowing her time was limited, she spent as much time as possible with Rowan, telling him about his early childhood, about the boy he had been before Voss took him. She showed him home videos from the mid-1980s, footage of fishing trips and birthday parties, and Rowan watched himself as a young child trying to recognize that quiet blonde boy with the fishing rod who became Eric and was now trying to become Rowan again. Patricia died peacefully in August 2028 at age 82, and Rowan was devastated. He had just found his mother after 37 years and lost her after only 4, and he spoke at her funeral about her strength, her decades of searching, her grace in accepting a fractured relationship. She was buried at All Saints Cemetery beside Martin, and Rowan visited the grave weekly, bringing flowers and talking to parents he barely remembered, about learning to forgive the Fletchers, about building a relationship with Iris, about trying to make peace with dual identities. Iris and Rowan grew closer over time, becoming each other's primary family connection, and they met regularly for coffee and fishing trips to Lake Geneva, returning to the place where Rowan had been taken, reclaiming it as a place of healing rather than trauma. She told him about the guilt she had carried for 37 years, about seeing him taken and not being believed, about spending decades advocating for missing children because she could not save her brother. And Rowan told her she had saved him by remembering, by never giving up. The fishing rod that Rowan had left on the pier in 1987 was returned to him after DNA testing confirmed it had been his, and he kept it in his apartment, and sometimes he would hold it and try to remember the 9-year-old boy he had been, the moment before everything changed. Rowan continued therapy into his 50s, working through layers of identity confusion and trauma, and his therapist said he was grieving multiple losses: his childhood, his biological family, his identity as Eric Fletcher, and the Fletchers who, despite everything, had been his parents for decades. He also began a support group for adults who had been trafficked as children, recognizing that their experiences were unique, that they carried different trauma than adult trafficking victims, and that they needed specialized support to process stolen childhoods and fractured identities. The documentary about his case was released in 2029 titled Stolen from the Pier, The Rowan Hartley Story, and it detailed Voss's trafficking network, the decades of operation hidden behind religious youth programs, and Rowan's journey reclaiming his identity after 37 years. The documentary sparked conversations about oversight of youth organizations, about how predators hide behind positions of trust and authority, about the importance of believing child witnesses like Iris, and about the lifelong impact of trafficking on victims and families. The story reminds us that time doesn't erase truth, it only delays it. And if stories like this move you, if you want to see more forgotten cases finally solved through DNA and advancing technology, subscribe to the DNA Archives, where new stories are shared every day. It's free and it helps these stories reach more people who still believe in justice after decades of silence. And it reminds us that child trafficking hides in plain sight, that youth programs require vigilant oversight, and that some missing children do come home but carry the scars of stolen identities. Rowan Hartley was 9 years old when he vanished from a Wisconsin lake pier during a church camp in 1987, taken by a trafficking network operated by the camp director Dennis Voss, who sold him to a Canadian couple for $50,000, and he lived 37 years as Eric Fletcher. Not as a tragedy alone, but as exposure of systemic predation, hidden within trusted institutions, as proof that trafficking networks operate through programs parents believe are safe, as validation that child witnesses like Iris deserve belief, and as testament to resilience in reclaiming identity after decades of lies. His fishing rod preserved the memory of who he had been, and that rod waited 37 years until he found documents proving his true identity. And in the end, his story became not just about one boy stolen from a pier, but about dozens of children taken from camps across decades, proving that some crimes are not isolated but systematic, and that justice requires exposing entire networks, not just individual predators, and that some people spend lifetimes learning who they really are after having their identities stolen as children. And healing is possible, though wholeness may never fully return.